Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So, hello and welcome to our Words of War Writers Workshop live reading and reception. The Writers Workshop was held over this past month and asked our participants to reflect on World War I and how the lessons learned there have affected their own lives. How, you may say, does a war that turns 100 years old this year still affect the lives of those living today? The fact is, though times have changed, many things have stayed the same. 100 years ago, war was fought in the trenches with thousands of lives lost for just a few yards of no man's land. Tanks were in their infancy and horses were still a battlefield mainstay. Today, war is fought as much in the control room of the drone operators as it is on the actual battlefield. The high-tech mode of today's warfare is a world away from that of World War I. However, much of the human element is the same. Mothers and fathers still send their sons and daughters off to war. Soldiers are sent into dangerous situations not knowing if they will ever see home or their loved ones again. Many soldiers come back from war not quite the same as when they left. So we asked our writers to look at the Great War and ask themselves, what did we really learn from the war that was to end all wars? How do these lessons apply to ourselves and our country? And can we use this knowledge to make a positive impact? So I'm going to introduce our first writer. Unfortunately, he's not with us today because he's an educator. He's a high school science teacher. So C.Thedford began his writing career at a young age. He won a contest at his elementary school for writing a book. And in college, he won third place in a national essay contest honoring Dr. Martin Luther King. And when he went on to college at North Carolina State University, he published his own newsletter, and he also worked for the school newsletter. He has taught math and physics in Eastern Africa, in Kenya, which inspired him to go on to be a teacher here in the States. So he's worked in Stone Mountain and Charlotte and Decatur. So he's also worked in the corporate world and as a civilian for the armed services. He's worked at the Centers for Disease Control, the Naval Surface Warfare Center. He's published other books, and including a science education book, poetry books. So Stephen is always seeking new opportunities to write, and the Words of War workshop provided him the opportunity to learn about World War I and improve the craft he loves. So he resides in Ellenwood with his daughters and his wife. So,
Good evening. I don't look much like Mr. Thedford, and just imagine me with bigger shoulders, a little bit taller, and a much deeper voice, and of African American heritage. And my voice is not the same, but quite frankly, I love his thoughts. So what I'm saying comes from me too. I'm sharing his thoughts because I do agree with him. He wrote an essay on Words of War. In high school, I remember learning about the different types of conflict in literature: man versus man, man versus himself, and man versus nature. But today there are two others as well: man versus society and man versus technology. As I read some of the Words of War books, I realized that the people in the stories were engaged in many of these conflicts. Since I had not read much about World War I previously, the workshop provided an opportunity to learn about people who survived the Great War, as it has been called by some people. My readings focus on Chad Williams' Race in World War I, Shirley Millard's I Saw Them Die, and James Norman's account of the Battle of Loos in France. Chad Williams professor of African and Afro-American Studies at Brandeis University, describes America at the beginning of the 20th century as a country divided by race. Sadly, the same is true today, despite the improved social and economic conditions of African Americans. What is different today is that there is no leader like W.E.B. Du Bois, whom African Americans can look to for guidance. Even though the Black Lives Matter movement can claim to have taken up the mantle, some people find it reprehensible. Despite the racism that existed in 1917 and persists in the 21st century, African Americans continue to make amazing contributions to America and the world. Yet, just like with World War I, America seems to have no desire to acknowledge that the so-called race question still exists. In Shirley Millard's letter in I Saw Them Die, the nurse describes an incident that would be considered sexual assault today. A doctor walked up to a nurse and kissed her while caring for the wounded. Yet according to her, this was not out of the ordinary then, just a part of the everyday routine of a nurse in a war hospital. In addition, she admitted that nurses were not entirely innocent either, and indulged in their fair share of flattering. She also mentioned that some of the practices adopted by doctors were not safe for the patients, such as not waiting for the drugs to take effect before commencing operations. James Norman was an American who survived the Battle of Loos attacks on September 15, 1915. He lied about his citizenship while on vacation in England, telling the British that he was Canadian, so he could seek the glory of war, death. He described the attack that he survived, saying that it was only by chance. He had just left his dugout in the trenches when they came under attack. The ground began crumbling, and the station he had just left was completely destroyed. Death and destruction consumed the battlefield. Massive bombs pounded their position. Cries of men dying could be heard near and far, and the body parts stuck out of the ground like doll arms and sticks stuck in a sandbox. Yet none of this stopped the men who were safe in their bunkers from risking their own lives to save their fellow soldiers. The battle didn't break these men. At the end of World War I, the Great War, people thought that this would be the war to end all wars. They were wrong. Words of War details the different conflicts that existed during World War I. Interestingly enough, race and sexual harassments are conflicts that continue to dominate the landscape of the American society. Yet the horrors of war that I read about in these stories were extremely disturbing, not because of the carnage inflicted on humans and the number of people killed, but because of the fact that human beings intentionally create more weapons for more carnage, more destruction, reaching a new level of depravity. But as I walked back from the library, where I had been working on my Words of War essay, a deeper and more personal revelation came to me. This happens often with writing. I had almost forgotten that I too am complicit in man's exponential determination to reach Armageddon. I had helped improve the missiles and weapon systems for the Undersea System Division in St. Paul, Minnesota, the Naval Ocean Systems Center in Point Loma in San Diego, California, and the Naval Surface Warfare Center in Silver Spring, Maryland. Thank you.